So I'm joined by Rich Ferraro. You are the Chief Communications Officer of GLAAD. Thank you very much for joining me.
Yes, happy to be here.
So I had a little look about your industry experience. You've done quite a lot. You were at Viacom for quite a few years, I understand. You've advised big companies, Twitter, P&G. So what's kind of been your journey?
When I started my career, I started at a public relations firm and I worked on financial and corporate clients. And at the same time, the firm was starting an LGBTQ employee resource group. I saw the industry bar was starting to raise. This was around 2006, where LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace was growing, but it wasn't where it is today. And through the media coverage, I saw the power of public relations. So I knew that my next job should be rooted in public relations, but I wanted it to be public relations for good. And rejoined GLAAD as Chief Communications Officer. I'm also an executive producer of the GLAAD Media Awards. What I saw in my first stint at GLAAD was the power that media had to change hearts and minds. And at that time, I was able to work on so many campaigns for marriage equality. Media used to be a one-way street out of newsrooms and a one-way street out of Hollywood. Now, GLAAD is working with social media companies, both on accountability and on content. We're working with social influencers because everyone is a media creator today. We work with new genres of media like Spanish language media, video games, and gaming. We work in kids' books. We work with local newsrooms. Advertising is the other big vertical that we're now working in as well. A lot of our work today in 2022 is more of a media resource. We have an arm called the GLAAD Media Institute that just does consulting work behind the scenes. And they work on scripts, they give script notes, they work on casting, they give casting ideas. Oftentimes networks will come to them with a show idea to get our feedback on it or to talk about the development of the queer characters. So I always tell people I have like the queerest resume in the entire world, but it's a badge of honor. There's a big difference between working at a nonprofit where we're able to make decisions very fast, go out fast on issues, and working for a large corporate bureaucracy where approvals and budgets sometimes limit what you can and can't say, and other issues like advertisers, et cetera.
Seems like you've had a real world relation in the work that you've done. So you think the work you did was kind of pivotal in getting the same-sex marriage bill through the second time, as you say?
Our sitting president, Biden, when he was vice president, he said that what moved him on marriage equality was will and grace. And it was this proof point that all types of media advocates point to say media, entertainment, Hollywood can change hearts and minds. What people see in the media, whether it's news or entertainment, it shapes the decisions that are made in classrooms, in offices, in living rooms, and in the ballot box. It shapes our culture and it changes behavior. It's why anti-LGBTQ people often go to the media to say lies about who we are. It's all lies. But because it's through the media, it's this lens of credibility. If we could harness the power of media to tell our stories, to humanize our lives, we would grow acceptance.
And you talk about the power of media and authentic LGBTQ characters. And I've been reading the Where We Are on TV report, which very interesting reading, a lot of info on there, which GLAAD compiles. And there's lots of record-breaking facts and figures in this edition. I know that 11.9% of all characters on US broadcast TV now identify as LGBTQ. When I read that figure, I think I was pleasantly surprised, but obviously there's still a long way to go. I wondered, what are your thoughts on that figure?
When we started this report about 25 years ago, there were 12 characters, 12 series regulars on broadcast TV. Now there are 637 LGBTQ characters across broadcast and cable and streaming. The quantity of characters has grown tremendously. That is a result of, one, advocacy from groups like GLAAD and the community as a whole, but it's also a reflection of the industry recognizing where younger people are today and where their audience is. So the Gallup poll from earlier this year showed that over 20% of Gen Z in the US are LGBT, and that jumped 5 percentage points in a year. 1 in 5 young people are LGBTQ. So the industry is recognizing that, okay, if we don't include LGBTQ people, we're going to miss a huge amount of audience and a growing demographic. And it's not just queer people, but it's also our allies. I think there's also a lot of earned media that can result when you tell LGBTQ stories the right way. Articles that get written about a television show or a film project. They've seen also a lot of critics drawn to powerful and accurate stories about LGBTQ people. And then GLAAD works on like the GLAAD Media Awards as a big incentive to incentivize networks and studios to greenlight LGBTQ. Because one thing I learned at Viacom is like they love awards. The industry loves awards and they're very competitive with each other. So that GLAAD Media Awards, we really put a lot of effort into the nominees in recent years. So that's one thing that we keep pushing these networks is if you want to be nominated for GLAAD Media Awards, if you want the community to respond well to your queer programming, you need to include LGBTQ people of color. You need to include transgender people. You need to include parents. You have to go beyond the white cisgender gay man character. We did a study with Procter & Gamble of advertisers and brand marketers. This study was about what are the barriers to including LGBTQ people. The barrier was no longer that they were fearful of anti-LGBTQ backlash. The barrier was that they were fearful of the community calling them out for not getting it right. The same thing is happening in Hollywood, where there's an interest in telling stories about queer people, but they're worried about getting it right. They're worried about the community, like I said, going on Twitter, going on social media and calling them out.
You mentioned backlashes from both LGBTQ people and the wider society. I think to address possibly an elephant in the room, the recent trouble with Disney and the so-called Don't Say Gay bill, parental education bill, which bans discussion of sexual orientation in some schools in Florida. Of course, it was voted through. Disney didn't originally oppose it. They did later, and It's had quite the troubling effect on disastrous PR coverage, arguably contributing to a massive stock price fall, widespread staff walkouts. I'm wondering what you think happened at Disney in this respect, because Disney's meant to be a very, very inclusive, very forward-thinking company in the past. Yeah. There's definitely been examples of that. So what did they get here so very wrong?
LGBTQ people have become so politicized that Disney thought that they did not have to speak out publicly about the Florida law, and they were trying to beat the clock so that they didn't have to speak out because they knew that right-wing politicians in Florida would respond negatively if they did speak out. Because we are used to, as a community, seeing corporate speak out about our lives. Happened during a few years ago, Indiana was considering a religious exemptions law that would allow discrimination against LGBTQ people. Mike Pence was the governor of Indiana, signed the bill into law, and then corporate spoke out because we rallied corporates speak out, corporates that did business in Indiana, and they spoke out, and the bill got reversed in North Carolina. But we're used to seeing corporates speak out on our lives and to stand with us, because so many of them during Pride Month do campaigns. They're always marketing to our community. And what we always say is it's hollow unless you're speaking out about our lives year round. Corporates going into the Disney situation, a lot of corporates were trying not to speak out because we've become so politicized in this cultural and political environment. So I think, like I said, the demographics are changing. Younger employees are more queer, but they also expect more from their employees. Employees expect their employers to speak out on social issues. And this has changed dramatically. Employees didn't used to have that much of a say, I believe, in what their companies were speaking out at. But now if you're working for a major global brand from the Disney situation, I think the brands are now on notice because they don't want walkouts from LGBTQ employees. So they're finding ways now to, again, speak out, but they're coming up against a tougher political environment than we had a few years ago. While a majority of US citizens support LGBTQ equality, the right wing has become very vocal. They could be very, very loud and be harmful, to your point, to business. Disney, like you said, has really strong values when it comes to LGBTQ. They had all the right internal policies. They've done pride campaigns. They've done advertising campaigns. They need to speak out for their values. They need to stand with their values. And these days, if you don't, your own employees are going to hold you to task on them. It's not even external organizations like GLAAD that need to do that work. And I would argue that external organizations and external pressures are not going to move CEOs the way that we were once able to, but the employees are. If Disney would have come out in the early days, stood by their values, and said that this would harm their business in Florida, things might have been different. Instead, their backs were against the wall. They had to speak out, and that was when the right wing really jumped on them. Since then, though, Disney has continued with content
Now I think Disney, they've realized the backlash and they're kind of releasing these Pride collection merchandise. As you say, there seems to be a massive push towards more inclusion in the Marvel films, the animation. Recently, Disney say they want about 50% of their on-screen characters to be of a minority group. That was recently said at a diversity and inclusion meeting. Do you think there's ever a certain figure which can be put on representation, be it in the workforce or be it on screen?
We do issue recommendations. I wouldn't say that they're quotas, but we do say that more of your LGBTQ characters should be people of color versus white LGBTQ characters. Benchmarks really serve a purpose in the industry, and it gives them something to shoot for. But I think that those benchmarks need to happen. Otherwise, corporates are going to do the bare minimum.
And about the BBC again, they actually pulled out of a Stonewall diversity champion scheme very recently. You know, the BBC pride themselves on impartiality, no bias whatsoever. And they cite these reasons for pulling out of this Stonewall scheme to remain very impartial. Do you think, you know, the BBC is sacrificing anything by pulling out of this Stonewall scheme? It seems like, you know, their commitment to diversity inclusion is being put on the wayside by pulling out of such schemes. Would you agree?
If the BBC was pulling out because of a hesitation to speak out for transgender people, or because they thought that transgender issues or people were somehow controversial, that was not the right move then. We in the States saw the BBC pulling back, not on a specific program, but on transgender equality. And that is, I think, a huge issue for their brand. And they've seen a lot of queer people in the UK speak out against that, a lot of trans people and a lot of trans allies, because they are being used as such a political pawn. Anti-LGBTQ activists are targeting children's programming and saying it's inappropriate for LGBTQ characters to be in children's television or films or books. Some in the right wing have demonized diversity as a bad word or as a threat to children somehow, when really LGBTQ people are in their daily life. Representation is going to teach younger people about diversity so that when they come into contact with it in their actual real life, they will know how to respond to it. They will be familiar with it. So there's no reason why entertainment should not reflect that. On the flip side, it's really important for children who do have LGBTQ parents to see families like theirs represented. They're not going to turn LGBTQ. Media does not have that kind of power, but all they learn is what they're seeing in their day-to-day life.
It's interesting, when Disney Plus first launched in the UK about 2 years ago now, the series sequel to Love, Simon, Love, Victor, that originally wasn't on Disney Plus because it was cited as unsuitable for children. Either Love, Simon or Love, Victor is now on Disney Plus, but it's interesting that some people at Disney, they put on Hulu instead, which is meant to be more adult.
That's a great example of them trying to kind of sit on the fence and not go, they will include Love, Victor, but they'll put it on Hulu versus Disney Plus. There was hesitation for full inclusion, but I think that's one thing that has changed as a result of the Disney situation. For Disney and for other companies, they understand that there's been a generational shift. Myself, my boss, like, we were used to incremental change, small steps. We were okay with smaller changes. The younger community as a whole are more vocal when it's incremental and not full. And that if it's not 100%, you're going to hear from them. Whereas kind of when I was trained as an advocate, we were okay with companies leading with incremental change.
I know that GLAAD is a global charity. You work very well on a global scale. I did a little survey myself for my project, and I asked about what people thought about GLAAD, and around 75% of UK people around my age unfortunately didn't know what GLAAD was. So I know you operate extensively in the US, but I'm just wondering if you have any plans to kind of further your reach in Europe or around the world, or indeed in the UK.
I see us as having a global reach, though we don't have an on-the-ground presence. It's something that we've always wanted to do. I think if the political landscape in the US was different, we probably would be doing right now, because in almost 70 countries, queer people are still criminalized. Now is the time to start moving on that. But as a relatively small staff, it's difficult to do work internationally and also here at the US at the same time. It is in our long-term strategy to create international hubs for GLAAD, to have folks on the ground, because we know that the model works. Reaching out to reporters, developing those relationships, teaching them how to do fair and accurate reporting on our issues. The same with entertainment and content creators. that model works. Before Donald Trump was president, that was really the plan for GLAAD and many LGBTQ organizations here in the States, is to really start expanding internationally. And then our political landscape changed pretty much overnight. When I said there are two ways to think about GLAAD. One is, yes, our public face is probably not prominent. Two is, another way to think of GLAAD is our behind the scenes impact, where you never know that GLAAD worked on a film like Eternals, but we spent many months working on that storyline and looking at cuts. So I think our behind the scenes work really does have global impact, because that's our biggest cultural export from the US, right? Like Hollywood and films and TV and celebrities, celebrity Instagrams, when they participate in GLAAD's campaigns, people around the world are seeing that. So I think that even if you don't know GLAAD's name, you probably have seen our work.
I've realized in, as close as the last 2 years, rarely things do seem to be improving very quickly. And I expect an awful lot of that is to do with the work GLAAD does. Yeah, well, thank you for your time, Rich. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's fun to talk to you.